All right, class. So in this video, we're going to kind of revisit one of the circuits we built for the LED and the flashing, because that one used some fairly basic code. So there's actually the pseudocode that we had. So basically, we were going to say the Arduino turns on, the LED will start blinking. It'll repeat that process until we press the push button. That changes whatever the mode is, and it worked, okay, but it was not the most efficient way of doing it because we had some problems with getting the push button to read when we wanted to read it. We actually had to hold it until the cycle of one flash finished before it actually processed. So here's where we're going to kind of rebuild the code, and in this case we're going to go ahead and use a for loop. That way, while we're waiting for the LED to be lit up long enough, it's actually checking several times to make sure that that push button has been pressed. And when that push button is pressed, it goes ahead and raises a flag, which lets us create a function, something that we're calling on a lot of times, but we don't need to copy and paste that code. We can just reference it and say, go do this command, I'll wait a second, and then it'll go ahead and run through it. So the new plan, okay, fairly similar. Okay, the goal is still the same, creating an Arduino controlled LED that switches on and off a flashing mode. And when it starts, the idea is if flashing is enabled, it will go ahead and check the push button every 10 milliseconds, but the LEDs will stay lit on for 500 milliseconds and turn off after 500 milliseconds. If it's not enabled, it's still going to check the push button, and at the end of every one of those cycles, okay, whether it's flashing or not, it's going to go ahead and check and see if a flag was raised. And if that push button flag was raised, it will go ahead and switch flashing to either the opposite of what it was. So if it was flashing on, it'll turn it off. If flashing is off, it'll turn it on. And it'll also reset the flag, so it'll be ready for the next time that that push button is switched. And to use this, okay, this is where we're going to call on a function of check push button. Okay, if the push button flag is low, it'll go ahead and check and see if the button is pressed. If the button is not pressed, push button flag stays low. Otherwise, we're going to raise it up. We may switch around the order a little bit in the other pseudocode, but to get us started, we're actually going to duplicate the project that we had already coded. Okay, give TinkerCAD a second to go ahead and process. And we'll start off the initial editing within the block code before we get kind of all the way into the system. So go back to block and text, okay. Zoom out a little bit, okay. And we need to pay attention to kind of what the intention was. Okay, so one thing that we're going to do, okay, is we'll actually get started up here. Okay, so if flashing is enabled, okay, we still care about that. Okay, but instead of having it as wait 500 milliseconds, okay, we're going to use a count up command. Okay, so we're going to tell it to count up. Okay, zoom out a little bit. Okay, okay, so count up by, we'll have it 10 to match the 10 milliseconds. Okay. Still need to leave that 10 milliseconds in there. Okay. And for I starting at 0 and going up to that 500 milliseconds that we kind of actually want. Okay. We'll delete that code and just copy this. And it's kind of the same deal. Okay, counting up by 10 for I from 0 to 500. Just make sure that we're remembering to set the pin to low, since this is when the LED is off. And this is where, again, comments can go ahead and help us out. Okay. And we're going to want to remember that we also need to call for that check push button function goes here, okay? Because this is something that we're not going to be able to have within the block code, okay? Okay. All right. Now another variable, going back to sign of our pseudocode change, okay, is that we know that we're going to have a push button flag, okay? So I'm actually going to copy that. Okay. We're going to go ahead and create another variable, push button flag. Okay. We're going to duplicate kind of the foundations of that function that we're going to create. Okay. So duplicating that for a second, because we're going to kind of split this code into two parts. One is where it's going to be checking to see if the button is pressed and we need to raise the flag. And a second case, when if that flag is raised, we need to go ahead and change the flashing command. Okay. So this is where we're going to have if push button flag is high. Okay. Yeah. So if push button flag is low, high, change flashing mode. And again, leaving comments to go ahead and help us kind of keep track of things. So if push button flag is high, this is where we're actually not going to need to have the LEDs turning on and off. So we'll go ahead and delete those. So if the flag is high, okay, and if basically if flashing is high, flashing gets set to low, else flashing is high. Let's see, otherwise we're setting it to high. Okay, so basically if the flag is raised, we're changing those commands. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and leave those on there, and I'm going to delete the wait time on there. Okay, so we've effectively kind of eliminated the else statement. Okay, but we still need to remember that if we are reading the push button flag, okay, this is where we actually need to also include that variable. Okay, so the push button flag, okay, will go ahead and get dropped regardless of which one of those is true. Okay, so finishing this up, push button flag is load. So let's go ahead and simplify the code a little bit. Now, nice thing about text is we could go ahead and just delete that. I kind of like being able to use the drop boxes because I think it is making it a little easier for you to kind of visualize. So this is now going to go on the bottom of the main function. Okay, so this loop is pretty much our main function. Okay, what's the program doing every single time it loops? Okay, all right, making sure I'm kind of reading through it. Okay, so flashing is high, then for every 10 milliseconds it's going to be checking the push button, but at the same point LED is staying on or off respectively. We've got 500 milliseconds either way. At the time that that loop is done, okay, we're going to go ahead and have it running through. Okay. So the only thing that we need to kind of consider is if flashing is low, we still need to make sure that we're going to call for that function. Okay? So I'll take care of that when we get into the text mode, but we need to remember that okay, if flashing is low, we're still going to need to check. Okay, so just having some comments in there makes that a little easier to recognize. Okay.
5 minutes later.
All right. So in this second part of the kind of split function, okay, we still have the kind of original copy to it, but we still need to kind of recognize how we're changing that. So let's look at the pseudocode we left. Okay? And I think we're actually going to tweak it a little bit, because in this case it's checking the flag first. I think it's going to be better if we go ahead and check the button first. Okay, so if the button is not pressed and if the push button flag is low, it'll stay low. Okay, otherwise push button flag, if it's high, okay, it's going to stay high. And if the button is pressed, okay, regardless, the push button flag will be high. Okay. So slight change in order can make the code more efficient, can make it less efficient, something that you're always going to be kind of thinking about and looking at how you can adapt it. So in terms of changing our code, okay, go ahead and copy this just to make it a little easier. So first thing is, this is going to be our check push button function. Okay. Again, leaving that because we can't create the function yet in block code. We need to come back and kind of take care of it later. So if the pin is low, okay, the LED to indicate that it's being pressed is low, okay, and our variable, okay, is checked, okay. So if the flag is high, okay, let's go ahead and actually make it a little easier, just change the code. So if the flag is low, the push button flag stays low, okay. Otherwise, okay, the push button flag is high, okay. We don't necessarily need, let's see, thinking about getting rid of some of the comments, but let's toss that one, okay. So we don't necessarily need to care about those. Otherwise, okay, if the switch is high, okay, and if, and I'm only doing this to go ahead and just add some clarity to kind of what's going on, okay. So if the LED is high because the switch is pressed, okay, and if, okay, the push button flag is low, okay, so we're going to duplicate that. Get rid of that, okay. Try and copy, there we go, duplicate that. So if the push button flag is low, okay, then we're going to go ahead and set push button flag to high. Okay. And because this is the only place where that's actually going to be changing, okay, we're going to go ahead and tell it that, let's see, so we can go ahead and get rid of some of the other print commands. Okay. So this looks a little cleaner. Again, we may find some problems as we go through this. We don't actually need that 500 milliseconds, I don't think. Okay. And again, good idea to leave some comments. So we know that so if the switch is not pressed, okay, so if the switch is not pressed, okay, and else okay, and we will go ahead and raise the flag. Okay. So again, leaving comments, good practice to go ahead and make sure you kind of recognize what's going on. So at this point, we can kind of check a couple of things. We could go ahead and try running this, but because we don't necessarily have the function set up yet, and this wouldn't necessarily work. So as you can see, you know, what used to work, okay. So it is kind of doing a few things. maybe not quite what we need. So we're going to go ahead and stop the simulation. At this point, we need to go ahead and change over to text. This is where we're no longer going to be able to use the block code, and it tells us that explicitly. Okay, so all the comments, all the things that you kind of left in there still exist. Okay, so we've got a couple of blocks of code that were a little junk. Okay, so starting off, okay, we know that this is where the function begins. Okay, so we're actually going to copy that, kind of pay attention to where the parentheses or the closing parentheses are. Okay, so function, yep, that's looking good. So copying that, getting outside of the main setup, okay, pasting it, okay, and I'm adding a couple of curly brackets, okay, to go ahead and create kind of the function. Okay, so the function is going to be a void one. Okay, it is going to be though the check push button function. Okay, no variables are going into this, so we just leave it as regular parentheses closed up. Okay, and then curly bracket to go ahead and kind of loop all of this together. Okay, again, text is going to be a little harder to read, but we know that the function is pretty much as we set it up in the block code. So from here, we now need to call on that function. Okay, so the check push button function. Okay, and then we go back up to kind of where we called for it. So I'm actually going to delete that. Okay, and then probably could have left the comments, but we'll go ahead and copy that. Okay, put the same thing there. Okay. And here's where we need to go ahead and check otherwise. Okay, so the comment that I left behind was if flashing is low, we still need to check the push button. Okay, so here's where we can go ahead and just add in, okay, the else command. Okay, so else, close the curly brackets. Okay, and then insert the function. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and have it delay 100 milliseconds. Okay, so in theory, okay, this should be functional. So we'll start the simulation. Okay, by default, nothing is flashing. We'll turn on the serial monitor, clear that out. Okay, so it's responding a few times. Okay, but if we just press it quickly, okay. So there may still be a few things that we need to go ahead and kind of vary, but by using the for loop, we're able to go ahead and insert checkpoints so we can have that push button being checked. And by having it set up as a function, we're not having to put that line of code in multiple locations. We only have to write it one time. So if we need to change something, if we need to fix something, we're able to go ahead and do it. And that's why, as we talked about in good practicings with programming, being able to compartmentalize, put them into single blocks. You know, this set of code does this one function, and then being able to call on that function multiple times makes it easier. Okay, and when we need to troubleshoot, it helps narrow things down. And while it's definitely a bit more challenging to go ahead and just type out all of the code, there are times when that's going to be needed for the more advanced functions. So hopefully this kind of clarifies why we talked about some of the other functions, how to use them, and hopefully you can create some cool projects with this information.